So, who gets to write the rules for a new nation? And what happens when a single, kind of ambiguous sentence, one that was slipped in by a founder most people have forgotten, actually contains the seeds of that nation's destruction? Well, to figure that out, we've got to uncover the story of a man you probably never even heard of.
This guy right here, this is Pierce Butler. He was one of the wealthiest men in America, a signer of the U.S. Constitution, and honestly, one of its most baffling figures. Now, you know all about Washington and Jefferson and Madison, right? But Butler's story, his story is absolutely key to understanding a fundamental conflict right at the heart of the American experiment.
Because Butler was a man of just startling contrasts. He was born an Irish nobleman, and he was a major in the British Army. In fact, his unit was directly involved in the Boston Massacre. You know, the very event that basically lit the fuse of colonial fury.
And yet, what does he do? He goes on to resign his commission, marries into a super wealthy South Carolina family, and becomes a general for the American cause. He was an aristocrat through and through. But when he got to the Constitutional Convention, he became this incredibly forceful spokesman for the common man, for those impoverished settlers out west. But here's the deepest paradox of them all. This same guy, this eloquent advocate for individual rights, was also a fierce, ardent defender of slavery and the proud owner of a huge number of enslaved people. So understanding this contradiction, let's just call it the Butler paradox, is essential, really, because it reveals how a nation that was conceived in liberty could also write bondage into its laws, all through the quiet, really determined work of men just like Pierce Butler. So who was this man exactly? Well, he was born the third son of an Irish baronet, so his path seemed pretty much set for the military, serving the king over here in North America. But after marrying into a wealthy South Carolina family, he sold his commission and threw his lot in with the American cause. He even organized offenses against his old comrades, from redcoat to rebel, in just a few short years. And so this is the man, this figure of profound personal contradictions, who shows up in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And he wasn't just there for South Carolina. He was really representing one half of a nation that was already cracking under the strain of its own huge paradox, slavery. I mean, you can just see how quickly the legal ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet. In the North, those revolutionary ideals of liberty, they were actually being applied to enslaved people. Pennsylvania passed a gradual abolition act. Courts in Massachusetts were dismantling the whole institution. Even the new Northwest Ordinance banned slavery. But, and this is a huge but, look closer, it also included a clause for returning fugitive slaves. So the core tension, it was already being written into law. But for delegates like Butler, the threat wasn't just some ideological pressure coming from the North. No, it was a physical border to the South, a line on the map that represented this constant, bleeding threat to the entire economic foundation of their world. The problem was Spanish Florida. See, since the late 1600s, it had a standing policy. Any enslaved person who escaped the British colonies and could make it to their territory would be granted freedom. For almost a century, this created a powerful lure and a constant source of anxiety for slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina. This fear of losing their property to a foreign power was absolutely front and center in their minds. Right, so armed with these fears, the South Carolina delegation, with Butler as a major player, went to Philadelphia. And they were determined to write a new kind of protection right into the very framework of this new nation. On August 28th, the convention is talking about the rights of citizens, and the South Carolinians, they were not happy. As James Madison noted, they wanted something explicit, something that would force every single state to recognize their property in slaves. But their first few attempts to get that, they failed. So they tried a new tactic. Butler and his colleague Charles Pinckney proposed a clause that would require fugitive slaves to be delivered up like criminals. Just think about that for a second. They wanted federal authority to pursue human beings across state lines as if they were fugitives from justice. But the response from a Northern delegate, Rother Sherman, is almost as shocking. He dismissed the idea not on moral grounds, nope, but on practical ones, saying it was more like returning a horse. A horse. Butler withdrew the motion, but trust me, he was far from done. The very next day, he introduced this version, and it passed unanimously with almost no debate. Just look at the language here. It's written in what you could call a frustratingly passive voice. It says a person shall be delivered up, but, and this is crucial, it totally fails to say who has to do the delivering. Now, this wasn't just sloppy writing.
This was deliberate ambiguity. It was a political tool designed to get a deal done. But it wasn't a solution. It was a ticking clock.
Because this vague clause, it didn't settle the issue. Not at all. Instead, it kicked off a decades-long struggle to define what it even meant, a struggle that would test the very bonds of the new nation.
So, how did this abstract clause turn into a concrete law? Well, the ambiguity got tested almost immediately. When 3 Virginians kidnapped a man named John Davis in Pennsylvania, claiming he was a fugitive, the states just could not agree on what to do. The whole conflict went all the way up to President Washington, which forced Congress to act. And the result was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, the first real attempt to put some teeth into Butler's constitutional flaw. And this 1793 law was a fascinating compromise, a really, really delicate balance. On the one hand, it gave slave states a federal process for reclaiming fugitives. But on the other hand, it also recognized the power of free states to pass their own anti-kidnapping laws to protect free Black residents. It created this fragile peace that, believe it or not, actually worked for a time.
But this settlement, born from Butler's ambiguous clause, just couldn't withstand the immense pressures that were building up in the young republic. It was a foundation with a fatal crack running right through it.
So several forces started to just tear this fragile compromise apart. In the North, the abolitionist movement got more radical, more defiant. In the South, slaveholders dug in their heels, demanding even stronger federal protections. The nation was expanding west, and the question of slavery in new territories became totally explosive. And as the price of enslaved people skyrocketed, the horrific practice of kidnapping free Black people became more and more tempting and profitable. And just think about this number. It's staggering. Between 1810 and the start of the Civil War, an estimated 1 million enslaved people were forcibly moved from the Upper South to the cotton and sugar fields of the Deep South. This massive internal slave trade made the issue of fugitives and kidnapping just exponentially larger and way more volatile.
Yeah, that old settlement just couldn't hold. In 1850, the balance was completely shattered. Congress passed a new, far more aggressive Fugitive Slave Act. It stripped away protections for free states, it deputized ordinary citizens in the North to help capture fugitives, and it imposed harsh penalties for anyone who refused. It was a federal mandate that absolutely enraged the North. And that was pretty much the final act. Northern resistance to this new law became widespread and fierce. The fragile compromise from 1793 was dead. The legacy of that vague, passive voice sentence, the one Pierce Butler slipped into the Constitution, had finally come due, and it played a direct part in the unmaking of the nation. Which leaves us with a really fundamental question, doesn't it? The story of Pierce Butler, the patriot and the slaveholder, the advocate for the common man, and the defender of human bondage, is really the story of America's founding paradox. It forces us to ask, can a house that's built on such a contradictory foundation, can it truly stand?